December 8, 1941, the news crackled across the radio waves like a thunderclap. Japanese planes had struck Pearl Harbor. For the American missionaries and sugar families scattered across the Philippine island of Negros, that broadcast changed everything in an instant. They were thousands of miles from help, trapped in a country that was about to be swallowed by the Japanese war machine. The Philippine Army had barely 3 divisions to defend the entire archipelago. The civilians on Negros knew with a cold certainty that they were now sitting directly in the path of an invasion. Missionaries Paul Lindholm and Gardner Wynne had built their lives around faith, not fighting. They had come to the Philippines to teach, to heal, to preach. Now they faced a stark choice: run for the hills or fall into enemy hands. One of them, a pacifist, decided he would surrender rather than resist. The other chose to flee with his family. The 2 missionary families gathered what they could carry and vanished into the jungles of Negros. From the jungles of Negros, a resistance movement grew, and with it, a secret so valuable it could alter the balance of the Pacific War. The question was whether the hunted could survive long enough to deliver it. By February 1942, the Japanese had swept through the Philippines. The pacifist missionary walked down a hill and turned himself in. He was taken away to internment, leaving his wife with 3 small children in the wilderness. She joined the other missionary family, and together they moved from hut to hut, always one step ahead of Japanese patrols. A young Filipino teacher risked his life to lead them, carrying food and finding shelter in remote bamboo shacks. Farther south, the Sugar families faced the same crisis. A 16-year-old American boy whose father managed a sugar plantation watched his comfortable world collapse. Their family abandoned their home and fled into the mountains with nothing but what they could carry. The boy began collecting scraps of information, Japanese troop movements, supply routes, the names of collaborators, and hid them in a battered suitcase. He did not fully understand it, but he was becoming a guerrilla intelligence agent. Another American family, led by a former sergeant turned sugar engineer, buried their valuables and melted into the hills with their 5 children. The mother kept her children quiet through long nights when Japanese patrols passed within yards of their hiding place. The jungle became a world of whispered warnings, cold rice, and constant fear. For nearly 2 years, these families survived on cassava bread, wild fruit, and the charity of Filipino farmers who risked execution to help them. On July 4, 1943, something shifted. 7 American prisoners of war, survivors of the Bataan Death March, crawled through a fence at a prison camp in Bacolod and ran into the darkness. They called themselves the Lucky 7. Among them were a Missouri sergeant who had been beaten and starved for 15 months, and another soldier who had watched his weight drop from nearly 200 pounds to barely 95. The Japanese hunted them with dogs and patrols, but the guerrillas found them first. The 2 escapees were taken into the resistance network on Negros, then smuggled across the water to Cebu. There they met a man named James M. Cushing, a former mining engineer who had become the commander of the Cebu Area Command. Cushing ran a guerrilla army that controlled whole sections of the island. He had radios, intelligence networks, and a direct line to General MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. Crisco carried a bullet wound in his arm from an ambush. Snell was racked with malaria, but they could still fight. They joined Cushing's patrols, raiding Japanese supply columns, gathering intelligence, and waiting for the day when they might finally escape the islands. The Lucky 7 had become part of something larger than themselves. By the autumn of 1943, the resistance on Negros had grown into a real fighting force. Colonel Salvador Absidi commanded 12,000 men in the 7th Military District. He had radio contact with MacArthur's headquarters, and he used it to coordinate supply drops and intelligence reports. The guerrillas hid American civilians, ex-POWs and ex-PO Filipino patriots in camps hidden deep in the hills. The Japanese knew about the resistance. They launched punitive raids, burning villages and executing suspected sympathizers. But they could not crush it. The guerrillas knew the terrain, had the support of the local population, and grew stronger with every American submarine that slipped through the blockade to deliver weapons and radios. The civilians who had fled into the jungle in 1941 were no longer just refugees. They were part of a network. Kenneth Osorio, now 17, had become a courier for UBSID's intelligence operation. His suitcase was stuffed with hand-drawn maps, Japanese propaganda leaflets, and reports on enemy movements. He did not know it yet, but his collection would soon be worth more than gold and more dangerous than any weapon he had ever carried. On April 1st, 1944, a Japanese flying boat carrying the commander of the combined fleet crashed into the sea off the coast of Cebu. He was killed in the crash. Other survivors, including a vice admiral, washed ashore where they were captured by James M. Cushing's guerrillas. Among the wreckage, Cushing's men recovered a sealed wooden box. Inside that box was Japan's most secret document, the Z Plan. It contained the entire Japanese naval strategy for stopping the American advance across the Pacific. Cushing had the papers hidden and began a tense negotiation with MacArthur's headquarters. The Japanese searched desperately for the lost documents, dropping leaflets and offering rewards. Cushing held firm. He would trade the papers and the civilians he had been protecting for a submarine evacuation. By early May 1944, the deal was set. Colonel Salvador UBSID radioed MacArthur that the papers were ready and that 41 American civilians and ex-POWs were waiting on the beaches of Negros. A submarine was on its way. The hunted were about to become the rescued. Lieutenant Commander Francis David Walker, Jr. brought the USS Crevalle out of Fremantle on April 4, 1944. For a week, the submarine skirted the Australian coast, pushing northward. Walker drilled his crew relentlessly, diving, surfacing, tracking, emergency procedures. He wanted a battle machine, not a boat full of strangers. By the time Crevalle topped off her tanks in Darwin and slipped through the Sabutu Passage, he had it. On April 25th, lookouts spotted a wisp of smoke off Balambangan Island. Walker closed at flank speed, identified a large freighter, and fired 6 torpedoes. The first struck amidships with an explosion that lifted the vessel into the air. The second broke off the bow. Within minutes, the target was gone, Walker's first kill as a captain. But the sub still had torpedoes left and a war to fight. On May 7th, Crevalle received an urgent radio dispatch from Admiral Christie. Her patrol was terminated. She was ordered to proceed to the eastern Sulu Sea for a special mission. No details were given, only that she should be ready by May 11th. Walker was not pleased. He wanted to expend his remaining torpedoes, but he set course for the rendezvous off Negros Island. The die was cast. At 5:46 p.m. on May 11th, Crevalle's black nose broke the surface off Balatong Point. A mile offshore, a flotilla of Bankas waited, carrying 41 American civilians, guerrillas, and former POWs. Among them were Sergeant Howard Crisco and Sergeant Russell Snell, 2 escapees from the Bataan Death March. The moment the American flag was hoisted above the submarine's deck, a cheer went up from the boats. Mothers wept. Children stared. Colonel Salvador UBSID leaped aboard and negotiated with Walker. He had not 25 passengers, but 41. 21 were children. Could the submarine take them all? Walker nodded. Sure, we'll take them all. Just hurry them aboard. In the next 38 minutes, the evacuees scrambled down the hatch. Mothers clutching toddlers, ex-soldiers with wounded limbs, one boy carrying a battered suitcase stuffed with guerrilla intelligence papers. At the last moment, the real family's banca was recalled from retreat. They were the final passengers. Major Ben Valoria handed a sealed wooden box up to the deck. He told Walker it contained captured documents, extremely important ones, bound for General MacArthur. A sailor stowed the box in the captain's cabin. As the sun set over the Sulu Sea, Crevalle slipped beneath the waves. The rescue had taken exactly 51 minutes from surfacing to departure, but the dangerous voyage home had only just begun. 3 days later, in the Molucca Sea, Crevalle spotted a Japanese convoy. Despite the 40 civilians aboard, Walker decided to attack. It was a mistake. A Betty bomber spotted the submarine and dropped a smoke bomb, alerting the escorts. As Crevalle plunged to periscope depth, a high-speed destroyer was already bearing down on her position. The first depth charge exploded just forward of the conning tower. 7 more charges followed in rapid succession. The boat was tossed like a toy. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down like snow. In the forward torpedo room, water poured through fractured vents and gaskets. The space below the deck plates filled, submerging the lower torpedo tubes. The periscopes were shattered, the radar knocked out. Motormac. First Class John Mayall clung to a pipe as the hull groaned. In the wardroom, Roger Wynne asked his mother to say a prayer. The crew rigged for silent running. The temperature climbed past 120 degrees. Two more attacks came, Japanese sonar pinging, searching. Radar man Henry Beale worked frantically to repair the passive sonar, finally hearing the escorts fade into the distance, while technician Albert Bauer stripped and dried the shattered SJ radar components, tracing the fault to a dislodged standing wave resistance card and manually rotating the antenna to restore a limited electronic eye. At dusk, Walker surfaced. The periscope shears were dimpled and cracked, the radar mast frozen, but Creval was afloat. She limped toward Darwin. Reaching the harbor on May 19th, the dimpled periscope shears bore silent witness to the ordeal. The sealed wooden box that had crossed the Pacific aboard Creval reached Brisbane by mid-Friday, May 19, 1944. Within hours, Colonel Sidney Mashbeer, head of the Allied translator and interpreter section, had his best team working on it. The sheets were bound in red silk. The Japanese reserved that color for their most sensitive documents. Major John Anderton, a lawyer turned language expert known as the Kanji Kid, led the effort. By May 23rd, they had produced limited distribution, translation number 4, the complete Z-plan of Admiral Koga Minichi. Copies were rushed by officer courier to Washington and Pearl Harbor. In Hawaii, Captain Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, read the translation and immediately spotted problems. He requested photostats of the original Japanese documents when they arrived. Layton and his small team retranslated the entire Z-plan overnight. The heart of the document was clear. Japan's combined fleet planned to concentrate its carrier and land-based air power against any American invasion force, seeking a single decisive battle that would cripple the U.S. advance across the Pacific. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, studied the Z-plan aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, as she steamed toward the Marshalls in early June. Spruance, a cautious and methodical officer who had led the American fleet to victory at Midway, focused on one phrase in Koga's plan: a flank attack. The document spoke of striking forces operating outside enemy bases, hitting the Americans on the flank. That single word lodged in Spruance's mind and would shape every decision he made in the coming days. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, read the same document aboard his flagship, the carrier Lexington. Mitcher was a different breed of commander, a pioneer naval aviator who had piloted one of the first transatlantic seaplane flights in 1919. He wore a trademark green baseball cap and sat in a high chair facing the stern of the ship, watching flight operations. Where Spruance saw a flanking threat, Mitcher saw an opportunity. The Z-plan revealed that Japanese land-based air power in the Marianas was the key. Knock that out, Mitcher believed, and the enemy carriers would be crippled before they ever reached the battle. On June 11th, Mitcher launched Plan Johnny, a 208-plane fighter sweep against Japanese airfields in the Marianas, a full day earlier than originally scheduled. The surprise was complete. American Hellcats caught dozens of Japanese planes on the ground and in the air, destroying over 100 aircraft on the first day alone. Over the next 3 days, Task Force 58 pounded Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, neutralizing the airfields that Koga had counted on for his decisive battle. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Koga's successor, initially believed the strikes were raids, not a prelude to invasion. He ordered the super battleships Yamato and Musashi to continue a separate mission toward Biak. On June 15th, American Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan. Toyoda finally understood the scale of the threat. He issued the order for Operation Eigo, the decisive battle. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the first mobile fleet, sortied from Tawi-Tawi in the southern Philippines with 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and over 30 destroyers. Ozawa believed he held advantages. His aircraft had longer range than American planes, and he could shuttle them through Guam's airfields. But he did not know that Guam's airfields were already wrecked, nor that most of his land-based air strength had been destroyed before he ever left port. By the morning of June 19th, Ozawa's fleet was 300 miles west of Saipan. Spruance had positioned Task Force 58 to cover the invasion beaches, still haunted by the fear of a Japanese flanking attack. At 8:30 that morning, Ozawa launched his first raid, 69 aircraft. More waves followed. American radar picked up the incoming bogies at 10 o'clock. Mitscher ordered every fighter into the air. Within minutes, over 200 Hellcats were climbing to meet the enemy. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. At 3:30 that afternoon, a massive explosion tore Taiho apart. Ozawa, persuaded by his staff, had already transferred his flag to the cruiser Haguro just before she went down. He still had enough ships to continue the fight, but he had lost nearly his entire air arm. On the afternoon of June 20th, Mitscher launched a desperate dusk strike at extreme range, 275 miles. The American pilots sank one more carrier and 2 oilers, but over 100 planes ran out of fuel on the return flight. Mitscher ordered every carrier to turn on their lights, lighting up the fleet like a Christmas tree to guide his pilots home. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. Japanese naval aviation was crippled beyond recovery. The Marianas would fall, and from those islands, American B-29 superfortresses would soon carry the war to the Japanese home islands. The Z Plan had given American commanders an unprecedented look into Japanese strategy, but its most profound effect was the paralysis it created in Spruance's mind. His fixation on a flank attack that never came prevented a more aggressive pursuit that might have destroyed the entire Japanese fleet, yet the caution that lost the opportunity also preserved the invasion force. Saipan was secured. Tinian and Guam followed. The victory at the Philippine Sea, though incomplete, was decisive. Spruance would go on to command the Fifth Fleet through the end of the war, retiring as one of the Navy's most respected strategists. Mitscher, exhausted by 4 years of combat, died of a heart attack in 1947 at the age of 60. The survivors of the Creval rescue followed separate, often difficult paths. Paul Lindholm resumed global missionary work until his death in 1997. His wife Clara lived to 96. Gardner Wynne endured 3 years in Santo Tomas internment camp and later returned to parish ministry in the Midwest. Viola, who had held her family together in the jungle, died of lymphoma in 1981. Kenneth Osorio's suitcase of intelligence papers was confiscated by federal agents. Most were never returned to him, destined to gather dust in government archives. Howard Crisco returned to farming in Missouri, lived past 80, and reunited with fellow escapees decades later. Russell Snell struggled with post-war trauma, but eventually married and retired to Florida. James Cushing, the guerrilla commander who captured the Z Plan, died of a heart attack in 1963 at age 53. Colonel Salvador Abcide succumbed to alcoholism and died largely forgotten. Sam Reel, the sugar engineer, died of leukemia in 1956. Francis David Walker Jr. retired from the Navy in 1965 and settled in Arizona. The ordinary crewmen of the Creval, Motormax, Rodorman, and technicians returned to quiet lives, their names recorded in patrol logs and reunion rosters, but otherwise absent from the history books. For the men of the silent service, the bond between shipmates was the only recognition they required. Ben Viloria, Abcide's adjutant, likewise stepped back from history, his wartime service complete. Rose Reel, who had held her family together in the jungle, lived on for decades, remarrying and settling in California. The USS Creval, after 7 war patrols, was decommissioned in 1946 and scrapped 2 decades later. Of the 288 American submarines that fought in the war, 52 never returned, taking with them 1 in 4 of the 15,000 men who served in the silent service. The wooden box that had crossed the Pacific in a submarine captain's cabin was eventually archived, its secrets long since extracted, its pages yellowing in the files of history. If you have family stories from the Pacific War or memories passed down from parents or grandparents who served in the submarine force or lived through the occupation of the Philippines, we would be grateful to hear them in the comments below. We read everyone. Thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. Your support helps us keep telling these important stories from history. We appreciate you being here.